Good afternoon, Mrs. Reilly.
Well, good afternoon, Alexa. How are you, sweetheart?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, wonderful.
So I have a few questions to ask you.
Uh-huh.
So first, can you please tell me about the town that you grew up in?
Well, actually, I was born in New York City, and I spent my first 8 years in the suburbs of New York City, a town called Rye, until my parents divorced and remarried, and at the age of 8, I moved to Florida. Daytona Beach, to be specific, and moved there. I have twin sisters that are 4 years younger than I am. So we all moved down there, and I was in a totally different environment, but I loved it. I loved growing up in Florida.
Was Florida, where you grew up, did it have a lot of segregation?
It certainly did. I was born in 1939, which is, I know, in the dark era for you. So yes, there was still a lot of segregation. Actually, everything was segregated as far as I can remember. Waiting offices in the back of a doctor's, office would have, colored waiting room. They would have separate drinking fountains. They would have separate, lived in a separate part of town. And there were a lot of us that were transplants from the north, and so I felt like I sort of fought the Civil War every day because, nasty words were used, the N-word, and there was the term African American was not even heard of. I mean, it was just the N-word or colored people, and really, there was nothing was integrated then. I don't remember churches or schools or anything at all. And I can remember reading a book that was called Black Like Me, and it was probably back in the maybe late 40s, early 50s that I read it. And it was a white person that had done some coloring to his skin. And he traveled through the South, hitchhiking and so forth, trying to find out what it was like to be a black person in segregated South, and being called slurs, racial names, not being served at a restaurant, not being allowed to use a restroom someplace. All the restrooms were segregated. You could never go into a segregated or an integrated restroom anyplace. And so if say a gas station had a restroom and it didn't have a colored restroom, then there was no place for a black person to use the restroom.
Wow.
And the whole book was about, it was horrible to see how devastating segregation can be. It assaults everything that you believe, everything that you know about yourself, your self-worth, and you feel like a second-class citizen. You still feel like you're part of the slave movement, a second-class citizen from the get-go. But anyway, that's a book I'm sure you could still find and would be very worthwhile reading it.
How were you raised to feel about the segregation?
I always loved all the black people. That was never a problem for me, and I came down to Florida I didn't know many, but I could not understand how people could be so racially divided and hateful. And so there were a lot of people that were born in the South, and they would use all the racial slurs. And I can remember getting into arguments almost every day about that with some of my classmates, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th grade, whatever, growing up. So, it's just very, very definitely a memory of mine.
So did that affect your friendships?
I didn't have any black friends because it was so segregated. So I'm sure I would have had that been a possibility. There were different schools, different churches, different everythings. I mean, it was like 2 nationalities, like totally different ethnic group that was in your midst that you couldn't associate with.
So do you think your faith had a major role in how you saw everything?
I absolutely do. I came to Christ, Alexa, as I went, a convenient school for me to go to when I was 6, 7, and 8 was a little Catholic school nearby. And I can remember going to that school, and a wonderful little reader called This Is Our Town. You know, all the readers that... I added wonderful little reader to your shopping list. What else? Alexa, off. By the way. Alexa, off.
That's okay. Continue. No, you're fine.
Have it on?
Yeah, you're fine. Go ahead.
Anyway, this little book was called This Is Our Town, and it was just a story about kids in a little village someplace. But at the end, they all go to church, and as they are there, the priest is telling stories about children who'd been martyred for Christ. And I didn't know really who Jesus was. I had never thought about it, but I can remember bringing that book home and saying, you know, God, if there's children that are willing to die for you, I want to love you. I want to know you too. And so I think that I was truly had a salvation experience at that point, even though I knew so little. But I can remember being on my knees. I can remember just opening up my heart, crying, and say, God, I want to know you. Who are you? Where are you? And I guess as I look back, I moved to Florida, and none of my family shared any of that belief system. They were not church-going people or believers in any stretch of the imagination. And I can remember the first thing I did was to find a church when I was 8. And I would walk to church it was a couple of blocks away. I walked to this little church every Sunday, and I got very involved in, you know, the various activities, church camp, Sunday school, so forth, and inviting my parents to come to any of the programs, and they just laughed at me. Didn't want to have anything to do with it at all.
Wow.
And I can remember, yeah. And then I can remember, I don't know how much information you want, but I would beg and plead for my parents to come to church. And this was a small congregational church, and then a friend invited me to drive with her family to go to the big First Baptist Church, which was very large and very wonderful, and a big part of my childhood. I remember just being a part of that church and all the activities. Would go to church 4 times on Sunday. That would be Sunday school in church in the morning, and then in the evening it would be called training union and church at night. And then I'd go to church on Wednesday night for the Wednesday night prayer meeting. I sang in the choir, so I went to on Thursday nights I would go to choir practice.
Wow, that's a lot.
And then of course I would go to church camp and all that kind of thing. But I can remember begging my parents to, you know, come and be a part of anything. We'd have a visiting speaker that was so good, and I would just know that my mom and dad, or my mother and stepfather, would accept Christ if they came. And my mother one night said, yeah, I'll come with you. And I was so relieved, and I was so excited. And we walked up these huge, beautiful steps of this big southern colonial church. And she opened the front door, and she put her foot on the door step, or the whatever you call it, the entryway. And she put her foot in it, and then she pulled it back, and then she looked at me and she said, "Now will you leave me alone?
Wow.
I've come. Leave me alone. Don't ever ask me to go again."
Did she ever go again?
Well, it's interesting. She went through her second divorce and moved out to Tucson.
Mm-hmm.
Golly, what year was that? Probably early 70s. And she moved out here and would come up and visit me every day, got to know all my friends. But I had 4 young children at the time, and then my husband's mother, Grandma Reilly, came out too. So we had a busy household.
Mm-hmm.
And and all of our kids were at Grace Christian School, so I was in the car a lot, taking them to various sporting events as well as school, and so I was, and plus I was very involved in Bible studies back then too.
Yeah.
And I remember, well, and my sweet darling husband was a Catholic, and so we were Catholics for a while. And the Catholic church that we were a part of suddenly ousted its priest, and I still don't know why. But during that particular time, I was invited by a friend just to go to an interdenominational church called Grace Chapel, and went. And I had never heard the word preached the way it was. I had never heard worship. I had never met so many wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became our, we went to the Catholic Church in Grace Chapel simultaneously for a full year,
Mm-hmm.
because my husband Bob's mother and brother were both in Tucson, and we certainly wanted to do the right thing. And so we would go to Mass on Saturday night or early Sunday morning, and then we'd go to Grace after that.
Wow.
So for a while, we would just hold all kinds of meetings in our home. Obviously, this is before a lot of radio and television, so we would get some cassette tapes. We would invite Catholic friends over or whatever, and we would play a tape and, have an evening of discussion and, a little potluck dinner or something. And my mother would always disappear whenever anything that we hosted anything. As soon as any Christian event occurred, she would disappear. And one day, she grabbed one of my friends, who actually, Alexa, was your dad's first grade teacher.
Wow.
And a very close friend of mine. And she was such a mature believer. And she took my mother took her aside. Her name was Diana. And she said, all right, I guess I better have what everybody's got. And so she prayed with her to receive Christ. And I can say that her life dramatically changed. She stopped smoking, drinking, swearing. Her interests became very different, and one of the first things I felt like I needed to do was say, Lord, she needs some friends of her own. And I was able to link her up with some wonderful Christian ladies that were very, very strong believers. And so she was in a Bible study, a lunch group, an art class, a lot of friendship activities with this group.
Mm-hmm.
So to see my mother's heart change, and I think she was probably late 60s during that time, after all those many years, was a dramatic miracle.
Wow, that's really rewarding too.
It was wonderful. It was
awesome.
Absolutely wonderful. So I thank God for that opportunity.
Wow. Okay, so going back a little bit, when you were growing up in Florida, did you ever take a stand against segregation?
Well, the one particular time that I did have an opportunity, obviously I did just in the classroom every day. We'd get into arguments, and I would be very, pro-integration and very upset when I would hear the racial slurs and so forth. Mm-hmm. And my heart was pricked every time I would go by something that said, colored waiting room, or colored passengers sit here, or colored drinking fountain, or mm-hmm. or no coloreds alive, welcome. And there would be those things too. And I think the time that I was able to take, I don't know how much of a public stand it was, but I can remember we all took the public buses often. They didn't have school buses, as I recall, and so I lived in a little neighboring community and would often take the bus. I remember just getting on the bus once, and there was a big sign in the front that said, colored passengers will sit from rear forward. And I just marched to the back, and I sat down, and the bus driver stopped and said, young lady, get out of the back of the bus. And I said, no, I'm not. And I really cannot remember even what happened after that. I can just remember saying, if somebody doesn't stand up for these beautiful people, you know, I need to do it.
Wow, that's really brave.
Well, it was I think who God made me to be, and you asked if my faith played a part, and I'm sure it did.
How were white people usually punished when they took a stand against the segregation?
I don't remember a whole lot of people taking stands, unfortunately. You know, it was just one of those, this was the norm. This is the way you live. This is where you live. This is where they live. This is what, where you went to school or church or the neighborhood you lived in. And so, unfortunately, that was just kind of the way everybody lived. Very, very sad.
Do you remember anything about Martin Luther King Jr.?
You know, I just was so thankful for him. I really, really was. And I was thankful for the movement that began, and it couldn't have gone too fast for me. I was just anxious to see segregation. It was I think it was poorly handled. I mean, they were busing people many, many miles, and I think it really it's a heart issue. It's a faith issue.
Mm-hmm.
You can force it up to a point, but I think it really is that. But, you know, even fast forwarding to the fact that my husband and I really wanted to get involved in mission work, and we wanted to go to Africa. And that was a huge part of our lives, and you remember well going to Mozambique.
Mm-hmm.
And but we went to Kenya as well and made lots of friends, both missionaries, white and black, and different ethnicities, and fell in love with a lot of people over there that you know, are just absolutely delightful. I'll just never forget some of the hospital chaplains that reached out in so many wonderful ways. And we took grandkids. Your brothers went over, and they would just follow these missionary or these well, both missionaries and some of the wonderful black chaplains, and as they would visit patients in the hospital. And we can walk down a hospital corridor, and I think everybody's familiar with them in the States. Lots of equipment, lots of big food carts, medicine carts, equipment carts, you know, every kind of device imaginable. Well, the corridors in an African hospital are just blank corridors. The only time that you would ever see a cart was when they would serve chai in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even have food carts because families came in and fed the patients, and I think medication was very limited. But they would make chai in great big pots of boiled milk. They would pour in lots and lots of sugar and lots of tea, and everybody
Mm-hmm.
would stop for chai. But I can remember, you know, your brothers, and certainly my husband and I, Pop, we would sit down and have chai with everybody. Even surgery schedules would stop. Everything
Wow.
would stop, and everybody would, about 10:30 would stop and have chai. So that was fun.
That's really sweet. At what point, like, were you in college when the segregation ended, or like when it was finally outlawed, or what point in your life was that?
Do you know, I'm not sure that I can remember a specific date because it was a long process.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to college and Columbia Nursing School back up in New York, and actually I don't remember any black students in either of those places. So I think the first black doctor that I met was in Kenya.
Wow.
And he was somebody that worked with Pop and was absolutely delightful. Peter Nathumba. Nathumba. And those were the days of the early AIDS epidemic over there. And I remember working with his wife, who was a musician and had her master's degree, actually, and we would go into the public schools over there and try to teach purity because part of the African folklore was the more you sleep around, the better protected you are against AIDS, which is obviously the opposite of what was true.
Mm-hmm.
And so these girls were coming down with AIDS like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so Peter Nathumba's wife, Michelle, darling gal, was very involved in, the trying to educate the young women over there.
Wow. Well, thank you for your stories.
Well, you are so welcome, beautiful girl. And someday you will have your own, and you will have your own children and grandchildren that will be interviewing you. And you'll have great stories to tell too, Alexa.
Thank you.
God bless you, sweetheart.
You too.